How many of us have ever heard the phrase, reality television is just like a sport? Has any of us ever heard that phrase before? Well, I am an avid reality television show watcher, and my favorite of all of them are the Real Housewives of any city. I am constantly enthralled by the shifting friendships and the highs and lows of these women's personal lives. But I also find that the show has a way to highlight the influx of capitalism in our country and the striving that it takes to keep up with the riches and magnitudes of those around them. The women fight, they make up, cry, but they are very, very funny. It is reality television, and if you've ever ventured into this particular type of television, you probably have a hard time looking away. These people are exaggerated versions of themselves. But part of what I find interesting about the show is that underneath the chaos, there is a survival of the fittest going on. Who is the most popular housewife? Who has the most Instagram followers? Who the audience loves, who the audience dislikes, all play a factor in the drama that they create. It is like watching a sport. The best players go after each other to win at a game that some people know how to play and some do not. The show highlights for me all the different ways that one needs to survive. And I feel like survival can be at the heart of these two verses in which we read this morning. When we look at Psalm 34, the verse that immediately sticks out to me is verse 20. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, keeping all bones intact, not one of them being broken. So when I read this verse, I started thinking about the idea of bones and brokenness. Bones are mentioned throughout the Hebrew Bible in various stories, most notably in the story from Ezekiel and the influx of breath into the dry bones for life. However, when you get out of the Hebrew Bible, the word bones is only mentioned 4 times in the New Testament, and not once are bones mentioned after the Gospel of John. I find it very interesting that bones are used almost 90 times in the Old Testament to describe us as human beings and what God does for us as human beings, but that word essentially disappears when you get to the end. Perhaps the use of bones gives way to another use of the word spirit within the New Testament. So I thought what it would be like if I replaced the word spirit with word bones with spirit in that verse of Psalm 34. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, keeping all spirits intact, so not one of them can be broken. Raymond Apple tells us that Psalm 34 is one of the several psalms in which a heading links the poem of this psalm with a historical event. The 1962 Jewish publication Society of American Translation calls this poem, quote, a psalm of David when he feigned madness in the presence of Abimelech, who turned him out and he left. Historically, the feigned madness is connected to 1 Samuel 21:11-16, which is when David faked being insane to save his own life at the hands of King Achish of Gath. Apple says that according to Jewish midrash that, quote, it is possible for madness to benefit people in some fashion. David used what was at his disposal in order to survive in a situation that required some sort of shifting and how he presented himself. Have you ever experienced those feelings? Have you ever stepped outside yourself in order to survive? And what does God tell us about survival? But yet, we have in this verse in Ephesians about the armor of God, a verse that has been interpreted to be about spiritual protection, spiritual warfare, good versus evil. However, I would like to propose that spiritual protection can also amount to the ideas of societal protection, as well as the physical protection that some people in our society have to have in our current climate in order to survive. We enact certain identities and ways of being that offer us a specific amount of protection, thus living in some sort of feigned madness to protect our lives. Life is hard. It can break you down when you have nowhere else to turn or no one else to turn to. In the Queer Bible Commentary, Carl Hand speaks to such clothing of oneself from the queer perspective. Hand says, quote, that Ephesians closes with an exhortation to assume a courageous spiritual posture and imagine ourselves in costume, surrounded with spiritual power and standing our ground. He says that, quote, queer people understand how to draw on an exaggerated persona as a serious source of spiritual power for victory. It is a strategy we have used to survive, to pursue freedom, and to express radical love. On the flip side, Neil Williams, in his article, Welcome to the Real World, the gospel story in Ephesians, speaks to the importance of these stories. Williams says, quote, each story has its own characters, plot, conflicts, love and betrayal, tragedy and hope. Our stories have characters, plots, conflicts, love and betrayal, tragedy and hope. They are foundational to our lives. They define how we think, how we behave, how we feel about others and ourselves. We make up stories to bring meaning and hope to our lives. We feign madness to bring hope and meaning to our lives. Williams says it right there as he equates these verses in Ephesians to specifically about the forces of evil concerning spiritual warfare. However, Williams loses me because he says that the real battle lay not with the oppressive Romans or Herod, but with the spiritual powers that needed to be defeated through death and resurrection. Which doesn't seem to be what I hear in Ephesians when it talks about standing up against the oppression of the Roman Empire and Herod. Williams almost seems to forget that same point he made earlier in that we make up stories in order to survive. We put on costumes. And it would be easy to say that what is going on in our world doesn't measure up to the focal point of our relationship with God and Jesus. However, when we push aside the current travesties in our world that affect our neighbors, our friends, and our families, we end up neglecting those around us, and our stories essentially only become about ourselves. We end up with bones and spirit of our existence that are broken. But the good news is that we know that God collects our bones and mends them so that they are not broken. God collects our spirits and mends them so that they are not broken. so that the collective we is not broken, but made whole. Donna Reinhardt says that, quote, recognition of the reason for the spiritual warfare against the individual as a part of the corporate body places individuals within the corporate setting of the church, helping them to recognize that their personal piety is for the sake of the universal church, not just for themselves. So what does this have to do with the Real Housewives? In the Real Housewives of Atlanta, there's always one housewife that they refer to as the bone collector. This is the housewife whom every housewife shares information with. It is the person they trust the most with their innermost secrets. The person that they know will hold on to their feigned madness. And God provides that same trust for us. God holds our madness. God holds our costumes. God holds our stories, our broken bones, and mends them. As I was finishing my sermon on Friday, Mitch sent me this poem from Steve Garnis Holmes, and I felt that it encompassed everything that I wanted to say, but I felt like I couldn't get there to say completely, and so I would like to share that with you, because sometimes the Spirit speaks to you through other people, and I would like to share it with you. He says, the armor of God is distinctly not armor, a renunciation of might, of power and force, a radical commitment to nonviolence. It's gentleness instead of fighting, service rather than superiority, listening instead of yelling, love instead of self-protection. You don't just renounce guns, you renounce bullying, aggression, making fun of others. You set aside the shield of cynicism, the helmet of acceptability, the sword of being right. For the sake of healing, you accept vulnerability, embrace risk, and stand with those who hurt. To put on the armor of God is not for the faint-hearted. It's to trust that love and utter dependence on the grace of God will keep you whole. For it will. It will. Amen.